How many podcast interviews have you done?
200.
200. So you've interviewed roughly 200 experts, biohackers, all of the things. If you were going to summarize as best you can, really, really brilliant, smart people share their insights or wisdom with you.
Well, I think the first is that everyone's oriented towards a particular perspective, and it makes sense. Like you understand both, you try to understand both perspectives, but then you go away with an inclination towards one side or another. My very favorite guests are the ones who help bridge the gap between the seemingly like contradictory perspectives. And a great example on that front is Joel Green. He has a book
Hmm.
called The Immune Code, and then a follow up called The Way, where he really eloquently argues both for and against carnivore, and then for and against veganism. And he like, lays out like really solid science backed arguments for each of them, and then he shows you how by integrating the two, they balance each other out. So the plant foods help balance out the drawbacks of the animal foods, and vice versa.
So for you, then, like the first thing that you would say is like that perspective thing. So everybody coming from their perspectives, but then somebody, it's like harnessing that ability to synthesize different perspectives. And are you familiar with the philosopher Hegel, by any
Mm-mm.
chance? Oh, so there's this really funny thing with him where he has like basically these two large group of followers that happen after him, right? And they split off and diverge, and then those ones create new ones, almost like our cells like divide and create new ones, right? And what's funny is it's all these people trying to interpret him and what he was saying. And like the thing that he was actually is most known for is ironically this idea of like creating synthesis, which is like an initial
Mm.
idea, or sorry, not synthesis, of creating thesis, which is this initial idea, and then antithesis, which is the opposite of that.
Yeah.
And then as those two go in together, eventually there's a synthesis, right? So they come in together. And it's always funny because that's like literally what his followers ended up doing, right? They split off into different branches and then synthesize, and then a new antithesis kind of emerges. So there's this new thing, and I often feel like we're moving towards a greater sense of synthesis right now, where there has been so many diverging opinions and beliefs and stuff, where we're finding more of those synthesized pieces of information, right? And I think that's something I really liked about reading your stuff and listening to your podcast was you really approach it from that lens of there's probably some amount of truth in all of these. How do I make sense of that all? Does that resonate with you?
Yeah, that's precisely it. Because, like you
Mm,
said, there is always truth, some degree of truth in everything, and then it's figuring how much, like, what's the weight of each of them? Where's the
mm,
balance here? And whenever I explore topics, I like to look at, okay, this is the perspective that makes sense to me, and I can explore and study that a bit. But then I need to be able to take the other seat at the table and be able to really articulate their arguments in favor of their perspective, which contradicts the one that I was just exploring,
hmm.
and be able to argue that equally as convincingly. And if I can't do that, it means I have more research to do and I have more of
Hmm.
my own exploration to dig into.
How do you balance that? Because there is, at least in our current world, it often seems like there is an endless amount of research, right? And I can imagine if you're having somebody with a PhD or sometimes two PhDs in a particular topic who's also done a ton of clinical work, and all, like how can you possibly try to get as much research to kind of be on their level in a sense? How do you do that?
Well, there's no way that if someone's has a PhD in a particular subject, that I'm going to be able to download, read, absorb, and then be able to speak as eloquently as what they've spent their life researching. No
Hmm,
way. But if I
hmm,
can't get to all of the touch points, the things that
hmm,
they think are the most important, then it means I need to understand their perspective more. Maybe not understand all the mechanisms behind how they arrived at each of these, but I can understand, okay, these are like the top 10 things or five things or three things around this paradigm. This is why they think them. If I want to understand the mechanisms, I can pull up a white paper or I can look at the research, see a diagram and understand it. And if I really want to, I can keep going deeper and deeper into that. But to like understand the synopsis and then as deep as necessary to be able to draw conclusions.
yeah. All right. Cool. So that's one. What are like two other things that you feel like you've really learned from interviewing all these people? It can be from them, or it can be just like the experience of that.
I'd say another important one that there are a lot of paths that lead to the desired outcome. Like there's a lot of different ways of training for a marathon, and you can talk to ultra marathoners, you can talk to the successful coaches. And again, this is kind of similar actually, like figuring out what are the core parts of their perspective, and then figuring out, okay, I'm not going to necessarily follow any one of these verbatim, but then I'm also going to lean on my own experience and wisdom in training for this. I can do my own research and I can figure out which of these things I can take from them and which I should leave alone.
Yeah, beautiful.